IVM.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the Musafir Stories, India's very own travel podcast, where each week we share the journey of travelers in their own words and relive their experiences with you, our listeners.
Hey guys, welcome to a brand new episode on the Musafir Stories. We have a very special episode and a giveaway lined up for you today. But before we get into the details, a few quick updates. It was a very memorable week for us and the podcast. The Musafir Stories was featured on the Wall Street Journal, along with some great travel podcasts for your lockdown playlist. The link is in the show notes. Do check it out. We'd also like to take a moment to thank all our guests and our listeners who have made this possible. Some of you who take time to write to us regularly. A big shout out this week to Tejas, Teki Topse, Shivani, Mohan, Batseri, Raja, Paras, and many of you who reached out on social media after the feature. Your support is much appreciated. As for today's episode, we take you to Pondicherry beyond the pretty homes, the cafes, and the promenade with author Aditi Sriram. As a part of the episode, we are giving away 2 copies of Aditi's book titled Beyond the Boulevards, a short biography of Pondicherry. All you have to do is listen to the episode, check out the Google form in the show notes of this podcast, and answer 3 simple questions. The contest will remain open for 2 weeks, and the winners will be announced in the next episode. Good luck, and on with today's episode now. So with that introduction, we'd love to welcome Aditi Sriram, an author, a teacher, and a traveler to the Musafir Stories. Aditi, thank you so much for being on the podcast and welcome.
Hey Aditi, welcome to the Musafir Stories.
Thank you so much. Hi, Saif. Hi, Faiza.
Aditi, why don't you go ahead and introduce a little more about yourself? We were really short and concise, yeah.
Well, like I was just saying to you guys a couple of minutes ago, I teach full-time. And so I'm forever either introducing myself or repeating myself because I teach undergraduates and they are never paying attention to me anyway. So I'm totally happy to do that. I live in Delhi. I have been here for the last 4 years and have been teaching writing, which is both creative writing and also what we call critical writing, to undergraduates at a place called Ashoka University.
Okay, wonderful. And where does the author Aditi fit in here? Because today we are here to talk about your book, which is about a place that's really close to us as well. We also made a short trip there not long ago. The book is called Beyond the Boulevards, a short biography of Pondicherry, right? So tell us a little bit more about that. How did that happen and when did that happen?
It happened as a sort of happy accident, I would say, in that I was one of those aspiring writers who decided I would find my inspiration from the outside world by creating a website and putting the few things I had written or published on the website and then hoping that somebody would discover me. And unbelievably, I did get an email from a total stranger saying, I found your website.
Oh, wow.
And you seem to be writing some interesting stuff. And who are you? And it turned out to be a publisher in Delhi, just generally looking for, I guess, new talent in quotes, new people, to sort of look for. And when I did, I was at the time living in New York. So I lived in New York for almost 15 years before moving to Delhi. And I happened to be coming to Delhi for some work. So I went and met them. And we had this lovely conversation about a novel I was in the process of writing. But I noticed behind her, actually, on her shelf, she had, of course, tons of books all lined up. And 4 or 5 stood out to me because they were these slightly smaller sized, like a Reader's Digest kind of sized book, all white with different colored spines, all in the same lettering. And they all said each one said a short biography of Bombay, a short biography of Delhi, a short biography of Patna, a short biography of Madras. And I was like, hey, what are these interesting looking books? Also in the hope of acquiring some, and so they said, yeah, actually we have a series going on different Indian cities, and we have been locating authors who have some special connection to these cities, and we have them sort of write their take on what the city is about. And so we call these books biographies and not travelogues and not Lonely Planets or those kinds of guides. because we're trying to imprint memoir and storytelling and history and culture and travelogue and that, that sort of that spontaneity that comes out of travel, or the surprise that can come with travel, planned and unplanned, all into one book. And I said, wow, that sounds like a lovely idea and a great series. Could I write one? And she looked at me like, wait, what? This was not how this conversation was going. And they said, well, which city do you have in mind? So I said, well, Pondicherry. And I didn't make up. I had this huge story about how my father grew up in Pondicherry, which is true. Okay. My grandparents have a house in Pondicherry, which is true. My, so they still have connections and memories and great nostalgia for Pondicherry, all of which is true. And I, therefore, have a very deep connection to Pondi, which was not true. But they seemed to buy up sort of all of it. So they allowed me to write a proposal, which I then hastily did a lot of research for and submitted. And then they agreed to go with it. But the connection I had with Pondi really was quite thin at the time. And it did have a lot to do with what I just sort of picked up from hearing my father talk about it with his siblings and my grandparents. They had all basically moved out of there by 1985. So around the time I was born, they were all out. The house was still there, but kind of crumbling at this point. And I then said, look, this is a small enough place that I could go there multiple times and learn enough to write something. But I did have some amount of a connection. And if I did enough research and talked to enough people, I was confident and brazen enough to think that, okay, let me give this a shot.
Okay, brilliant. So it was a sort of a discovery and a journey for you as well, right?
It definitely was. Yeah. Yes, yes.
So wonderful. Now we have a little bit of insight into why Pondicherry, right?
Yeah.
Now, just assuming that some of us still live under a rock and don't know where it is, would you help call out the orientation of the place as well, like where it is located, etc.?
I will try my best. To geographically locate it, Pondicherry it's a city, but it's also the name of the Union Territory in which it is the capital city. Mm-hmm. And it's a little small stretch of land that's basically not just south of Tamil Nadu. And if you are driving about 3 hours south of Chennai, if you go from Chennai down south and kind of keep the beach to your left, so you're just driving south, go for about 3 hours and you will enter a lovely little town. And that is Pondicherry. So the city is its own distinct space, but the Union Territory stretches over to these other enclaves that are Yanam, Karaikal and Mahe, and formerly a city all the way up in Bengal called Chandarnagar, which quit this whole situation in 1949 way back. But Pondicherry as a Union Territory is this kind of spread out thing, but still occupies only a small amount of actual real estate in the subcontinent. It does, however, happen to have a very long and deep history that far exceeds the little amount of space it takes up. Of course, the fact that it's on the coast is a huge part of that history because, of course, that meant it was accessible and exposed to traders and sailors and travelers from centuries before as well.
Right. Sure. And also to add to all of the wonderful information you've given, you might come across the term Puducherry these days, right? I think it was 2006 that it was renamed. So, there's a few names that are being thrown around. And even just going back into history or going back into time also, right? Like you mentioned, this has been on the coast and...
trade has been pretty
as a result of that, trade has been central to that. And I think some of the discoveries made later on seem to suggest that... perhaps not the current day Pondicherry, but not far away from Pondicherry. I think Arikamedu, I don't know if I'm butchering the pronunciation, the name there. But it's believed to have been a trading post as early as the 1st century, right? So that's how long ago, since when, there has been travel from Europe and other places. So that way also, there is that connection to Pondicherry. But what seems to stand out and what we see today is the French connection, right? That's what is what still lingers on. So would you like to call out a little bit of the French connection and the French history also, Aditi?
Oh, sure. And you're right that what we see today still standing in Pondicherry, or what we think we're listening to in terms of the language and what we're eating and some of the bakeries and the croissant and all the French bread and even streets that have the French names, makes it seem like the most major influence was the French one. Mm-hmm. And to some extent that's true. It happened, it was the most recent one. It was the colonial power that was in power before it became independent or before it moved over to India. Yeah. However, before the French, you had, for long and short amounts of time, you had several other people. There were the Portuguese, the Danes, the Dutch, the British. And in fact, there was quite a bit of squabbling between all of these. So it would go to France for a number of years and then come back to the British. And then the French would take over again. And then someone else would interrupt. And so the city is actually an accretion of different influences. And those have all built up over time into what is now Pondicherry. So of course, superficially or on the surface, you see the French influence. Like I said, you see here in taste. But the city layout, for example, the way the roads and waterways and things were laid comes back to the Dutch, in fact, back in the 17th century. Arikomedo were talking about, sort of the remnants of what could have been a trading post, whether that was a Roman thing from the first century or even something. There was a Spanish structure there, some kind of monastery where, and that was a whole separate influence, or rather, group of people who were coming. So each of these things exists. The tourism industry that is built over the last, since 1947, I suppose, has capitalized on the French connection because, to your point, that is still a live one in terms of actual government and cultural connections that are absolutely still running between Pondicherry and France.
Yeah, definitely. And while reading up your book as well as doing some research, even I was a little flabbergasted to find out that I think it was up until 1962, right, when the technical transfer of power to the Indian Union happened, right? So there was still the French connection up until that point, even though India got independence in 47. Right?
Yeah, so India gained independence in 47. I'm sorry, you're right. But the French did not leave Pondicherry until 1954. Yeah. So Pondi was not yet independent in 47. Yeah. So they get independence in 54. Nehru comes to Pondi to sort of welcome it into India in 55. Gives this whole great speech about how Pondicherry will be India's window onto the world and will still kind of have a gaze upon France, and there's this beautiful relationship here. Like it did not read and feel the way it did when the British left India, right? Much more with the tail between its legs kind of scenario. And even after 54, it was only 1962, as you point out, Saif, that they were actually up and out. It's like saying, I'm going to move houses, and then you're packing boxes for a bunch of time, and then eventually you've actually locked all the doors behind you.
Right. Yeah. So, Aditi, in short, if you have to even put out the current French connection that you can feel with respect to Pondicherry, how would it be from a tourist perspective?
Oh, I think a tourist will be quite satisfied. They can visit an Alliance Française, which is a cultural center of French where they can hear the language being spoken. They can eat, they can drink, French cafe, and they can have a croissant. They can, eat lovely snacks by the beach. They can interact with people who are actually French or speak their language beautifully. They can watch movies in French and so on. They can go to several restaurants in the city that either are all out European food or French food, right, or nice fusions of Indian and European flavors. There's a great chocolate shop. Pondicherry also produces brilliant chocolate, and so that's another thing that I suppose is also something somewhat in common with that sense of the European or the French dessert. You can also walk down different streets and see, like I said, the street names in French. Right. You can hear people speaking in French as locals. There are churches that do sermons in French as well as English and Tamil. So there are several French churches and cathedrals. You have there's a French Institute. Consulate. Of course, you have the French consulate. Yep. They celebrate French Independence Day, Jour de la Bastille on July 16th. Or I got that wrong. It's something else in July. But, so all these things are still very much take place. And you still have monuments, you have buildings, you have people, the language, the culture, the flavor. These are all very present. And part of the more tourist visited area of Pondicherry it's sort of divided into these different, you can say, neighborhoods. Okay. They were called quarters at one point, and I mentioned the Dutch laying out the city a certain way, but they had done it by you could say profession, you could say caste, you could say different things in terms of how they wanted to lay it out for easy access between traders and easy access between businessmen and this and that. But sort of the most picturesque area, which is the sea-facing side, is called the French Quarter. And that is where all these streets are with French names and so on. You go a little outside of this area, you could feel like you are in Tamil Nadu. I mean, you have lungi wearing men and sari wearing women and their bindis and whatnot and all roaming around, speaking in Tamil, going to temples, going to churches. I mean, doing their thing, and eating, dosas on steel plates and just like living life. Sending their children to Tamil medium schools and watching Rajnikant movies and like very happy, and that's just a few streets away often from a building that was built by the French, or a lighthouse that was erected for a French astronomer when he came in 1761 to do this and that and the other. So that's a cool kind of juxtaposition. And you did ask me to say this to you in short. I totally didn't do that. I'm sorry.
No, you did a great job. And you were right. It was July the 14th.
14th. There we go.
Cool. Now, I also wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper into the way the city is structured, right? Obviously, you captured how it's broken up by the quarters and all of that. But I found it really interesting. Like this is actually comes out really vividly, right? It's not that it's like some of the other places, right? Here we have, for example, in Bangalore also, we have that kind of, not exactly quarters, but there was places where the Britishers traditionally lived versus where the locals lived, etc. It's not that
distinct.
It doesn't stand out as much. But in Pondicherry, on the other hand, like you said, it stands out quite a bit, right? So would you kind of give us a little bit of a window into how these quarters are broken up and like the grid system that it's divided into also, the city?
Definitely quite a bit of this has been, let's say, solidified because of the tourism that it's brought in and the desire that folks have to come and visit a cathedral, a church that was built with this particular grotto that mimics something that is in a church, in France, and they want to come for this particular kind of darshan of this particular version of the Virgin Mary, who, by the way, is wearing a sari in that particular church because it's still a church in Pondicherry in South India, kind of thing, which is why these juxtapositions are actually so lovely, because you look and see what seems to be obviously, let's say, European or foreign influences, and then they actually have these fantastic stories and folklore that are deeply Indian. So as far as what we mean by the French Quarter, which is also, by the way, known as White Town, back in a time when it was less politically incorrect, but you were still making a political point about saying the White Town and Black Town, white folk and non-white folk, they said black. Now, of course, these words have much more charged meaning. But Pondicherry is, like any other city, a kind of amorphous blob, let's say. But there is this one sort of oval that is contained within these 4 boulevards. And I name the boulevards, and I take the reader at one point early in the book on a little sort of motorcycle ride around the boulevards. Because in Pondi, everybody goes everywhere on motorcycle. You can go on foot, but that would have been a very long walk. And if people would have stopped reading my book, I think that would have been the whole book. But within these boulevards, you've got this oval. Okay, now the southern, the bottom half of the oval just lines up with the sea. Right, so that's the Bay of Bengal, and so if you can picture, you've got a little bit of like sort of like a strip of sandy coast. There are people who can walk there. I mean, the sort of pedestrians come and walk there, and so on. And that whole part is just buildings facing the sea, greenery, blue skies, blue water. It's lovely. And if you were to take this oval and divide it in half longitudinally, right? So you have an upper half and a lower half. That lower half is basically the French Quarter. Right. The upper half you could split into 2 or even 3 pieces, and you could call them the Tamil Quarter, the Muslim Quarter, the Christian Quarter, the Hindu Quarter. So I've given you more than 2 or 3 names, but these sort of overlap a little bit. So the Christian Quarter, the Muslim Quarter, and the Hindu Quarter are also the Tamil Quarter. I mean, they all fit into the Tamil Quarter, because the first kind of delineation was French versus non-French, right? Of course, the French were Christians. So all the churches are typically in that area, and temples and mosques and other places of worship, or even just other sort of cultural sites for the locals were demolished and they were rebuilt elsewhere, or that's already how the city was kind of laid out. An interesting piece of trivia there is that there is a very, very old Ganesh temple which is in the French Quarter. And it was never, or I think the French tried to move it, or they tried to kind of, this is an urban myth I've heard a lot, which was that they kept trying to throw out the main deity, like the main idol. They sort of kept throwing off into the sea to say, no, this is no, we're going to actually raise this temple to the ground and build a church or do something else. And the deity kept washing back on the shore, kept washing back up. And finally the French gave up and said, okay, we can't move this temple. So our perfectly kind of uniform French Quarter is going to have this thing off to one side, and we'll just sort of let it be there. Of course, ironically, if you will, after that temple and long after the French, not actually long after the French, even while the French were there, Aurobindo Ghosh shows up, this like random young Bengali fellow, and of course has left since then a big spiritual center in very much the French Quarter of Pondicherry. And interestingly, the French took to that in a different way, because Aurobindo had French connections and wrote and spoke in French. And so what he was espousing was something that was sort of, I think, more palatable to the French and to foreigners and to Europeans. And so that has a different vibe when you're walking around that area of the French Quarter versus when you go to this Ganesh temple, where you can smell jasmine flowers and there are women sitting outside trying to sell you flowers and diyas and this and that. You can smell oil and you can smell ghee and you can smell prasad being made, and you come to the ashram, and that's a different kind of immaculate space and feel. So one is certainly more European than the other, right? Even just visually. But that's how these quarters are laid out. But again, having said that, what is great about the city is that, and about the population, is that they have grown up with this, right? So in some ways, these areas can feel segregated, or people can choose to segregate, but every evening, what they call the promenade, which is a strip of road down by the beach, so very much in the French section, and like I said, kind of just walking along the beach, is shut out to cars and motorcycles and open to pedestrians and this is every day of the week, every week of the year, from 6 p.m. to next morning 7 a.m. or 6:30 to 7:30. They'll shift these hours a bit. And everyone shows up for a walk. Massive Muslim families with children and lots of women and men all walking together. Old men and women who are taking their very old walks with their very loud, headphones or Walkmans, or like they'll be betting music from their pockets. It's so cute and charming. Little kids, young men who are like now sort of on the prowl, if you will, tourists, people who are visiting, ashramites who are going for a walk, like everyone will be there. Like it's this like non-explicit party. And in that moment you feel like, okay, there are quarters and there's whatever, but the beach it's still open, it's still open air, it's still, they hold little events along the beach, they set up stages and they'll have festivals and they'll do dance performances and yoga events, and they'll have political rallies, and then all kinds of things will happen because that space is just so conducive to like large groups gathering. But it's also terrific for a walk. And Pondi said, look, we get it. We will shut this down because we believe in the fact that these spaces are open. Yes, it's called a promenade, or it's called Rue Goubert, or it's called Beach Road. You can call it a whole bunch of different things. But you can get there and you can come from whichever little neighborhood you're coming from. And nobody cares who you are. Not that nobody cares, but they expect you to be there.
Yeah, it's also very interesting, right? Like you're calling it out. There is this diversity. There is this, different quarters like they've been marked out. But at the same time, there's also this pluralism, right? That they are embracing. They are embracing of everyone who's there. It's the city as a whole. It has its own vibe and its own culture, right? And it also actually comes out really well in your book, where you've kind of called out, like, is it a white town? Is it a black town? What is it, right? So some beautiful lines that kind of stuck with me also, and speaks, like you said, right, speaks tons about the tolerant nature of the locals there also. They've always been embracing, be it, like you said, initially the French or the others. Maybe at that point they didn't have a lot of choice, but the point that it's lived on beyond the time the French were here. And even like speaking of embracing people or embracing outsiders, right? You touched upon Aurobindo Ghosh earlier, right? And,
yes.
Aurobindo Ashram, the ashram, like it's known, right? It's very, very integral to the whole DNA of Pondicherry of sorts also, right? So do you want to speak a little bit about that for people who might not know too much about the ashram?
Sure. It's really quite an interesting story. There was once a young man who was he was a revolutionary, he was a freedom fighter named Aurobindo Ghosh, who lived who was raised in Bengal in Calcutta and then went abroad to do his studies, came back. This is all pre-independence, of course. Mm-hmm. And comes back to an India that's now in the throes of fighting for independence and kind of figuring out its own identity and everything. And he was making enough of a mess, let's say, in Bengal that the British were getting sick of him. So they wanted to arrest him and, do whatever they had to do. So he fled. He escaped the scene and came off to Pondicherry because Pondicherry was under French jurisdiction at that time, not Indian, not British. So he technically could not be arrested there anyway, right? Or rather, the British could not technically access him there. And so 1910, he shows up in Pondi. And no one knows who he is, or they've heard maybe whispers about him. But at that point, he's just someone who's trying to articulate a new political voice, a new political future for India, and is doing so through magazines that he was writing in and starting and speaking about with friends of his, colleagues, people he knew abroad, and trying to get a circulation going. And he was writing, like I said, not just in English, he could also write in French and just communicate different ideas. And I guess being in Pondi, the French language came in handy. It was also, I think, exposing him to more people. And what started off as a kind of political quest on behalf of the nation, right, which is already a kind of abstract idea, that I think mixed with the fact that he was under house arrest in Pondi, or not under house arrest, but basically confining himself to the house so that he couldn't be spotted by accident by someone outside or to a British cop or spy who would then go and tell the French, things of that nature. He, let's say not surprisingly, and maybe people can relate to this now, in all of his self-quarantine, he just found that he was reflecting a lot more on his own internal state, right? And what does it mean to be who I am, to be where I am? What is the meaning of all of this and life, and what is freedom, and so on. And his writings went in that direction. So they kind of veered away from overt, let's say, more aggressive or assertive political communications to something more spiritual, more internal, more reflective. And by the 1930s, he had actually developed a following of people who had been hearing about his writings. And he was sort of, you could say giving lectures, but that sounds very formal. It was more these sort of little talks he would have. And there were a few friends who would come to see him, and there were people bringing him food and keeping him abreast of movements in other parts of India. So that group kind of grew into something larger. And then they would all sort of sit at his feet and listen to him talk about things. And that evolved into this whole thing. So that by, like I said, 1930s, 1940s, there were Indians from Bengal, where he was from Orissa, from Gujarat, from other parts of the country who said, we are hearing about this man or this guru, Sri Aurobindo, and we want to understand what he's all about. And they were uprooting and traveling at a time when it was not easy to travel, right? And travel such long distances. And they all came and basically fell at the feet of this man and said, we are here to learn from you. Mm-hmm. And he was not too comfortable with this or didn't quite know how to proceed. Conveniently, around the same time, a woman who had come from France with her husband to come and sort of speak with Sri Aurobindo and study with him and so on. She ended up staying put with him and leaving her husband, or he sort of understood that there was something here. I'm not saying necessarily romantic, but there was some kind of connection that these two clearly had. And he, obviously wasn't thrilled about that, but he sort of took his cue and left. And this woman, Mira Alfasa, her name, she stayed and sort of became Sri Aurobindo's, you can say, spiritual partner or companion, or you could even say sort of spiritual business partner. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that there were people coming, you needed to make arrangements and find places to put them up and figure out what on earth they were going to do as a group, if anything. And she really propelled a lot of that. So he died in 1948. Of course, the story around his death is also that he took, that sort of, he decided that this was going to happen. He left his body. And there's tons of writing about it, of course, all in the ashram library and archives. But he basically told his devotees or his disciples, look, this is the mother, she is your mother, she is the mother, and she will carry this forward, Like, I am no longer here for this kind of stuff or to mediate and speak with you. I'm, busy in my own sort of moksha quest, so she then sort of took charge, and by that point they were buying property in Pondicherry. They needed space, they had people, they needed to make houses, and there's a dairy in the French Quarter, there is a granary, there is a dining hall, there's a library, there is an archive space, there's a beautiful the actual headquarters where the two are buried, that is there. There are different, there's housing and hostel space for different people who come. There's a ton of ashram stuff, all in the French Quarter, and a little bit outside of that as well. It's really quite amazing to see. And all this, I was describing to you that oval, right? So all of this stuff is happening in this oval alongside theaters showing Rajnikant movies, and guys getting drunk in a bar, and tourists coming to eat baguette and walk on the beach. And you wouldn't even necessarily know that this was happening, because these buildings are not sort of loud or advertising anything loudly. They're kind of quietly going about their day. And so that's what he left behind in Pondicherry. And then it kind of spread, actually. So many people that I've spoken to about the book or about Pondi would say, yes, I've come to Pondicherry. I've been to the ashram. I went to Auroville. And I'd have to say, that's really great. But actually, Auroville is separate from Pondicherry and separate from the ashram. It's pretty similar in terms of, age and history, in that Auroville was something... It was this utopic ideal conceived of by the mother who said, I want to build a society or help, I want to make clear space and create a society that's free of money and free of vice, and everyone who lives there will share with one another, and it'll not have any of the claws of capitalism and other isms encroaching upon it. It'll be a truly international society, and people will come there and live happily, and so she had this idea, and basically the land for this, and what has now turned into what we call Auroville, is this area that is actually geographically, it's in Tamil Nadu. You have to drive about 20-30 minutes outside of Pondicherry, and then you make a left off the highway. You drive in for a bit, and then you're kind of in this cluster of trees and some buildings and some pavilions and solar powered this and water powered that and bamboo inspired this, and really cool, innovative stuff. And lots of non-Indians. You have a lot of foreigners who were drawn to this idea. And they are all based in, that is what Auroville is. It's about a 2,000, 3,000 strong community now. The mother had spoken of this as being like a 50,000, a sort of microcosm of the world, a small town that would house all of these ideals and these ideal people, and they would plant trees, and they would do all these amazing things and conserve the environment and whatnot. And some of that does indeed happen. But yeah, so that is Auroville, and that is a separate thing from the ashram. But that's what the ashram is, and the impact it's left on the city.
Yeah, and I think what is also brilliant about the book is such stories, right? Stories about individuals and stories about, I guess, more of the iconic people like Aurobindo, right? It's not only about them, but it also has stories of the locals, stories who live there, and they're beautifully intertwined and interlaced, kind of connecting and giving us an insight into what life is there. So that's a beautiful feature of the book I liked. And just talking more about similar stories, right? Another one of the story
is the I Mandapam
exactly.
story. Yeah, so Aditi, can you just tell us, because you've encapsulated the entire story very beautifully in your book. So would you like to call out a little about it?
Sure. And so this is one of those fantastic moments in Pondicherry's geography and history and culture where it's not clear whether this is something from the French or something from South India or something totally made up or something like my dad thought he remembered his friend telling him when they were, 12-year-olds in Pondicherry sneaking away for a swim, and they didn't know how to swim, and, all of the lore that comes with any one of these kind of, you're not quite sure what the original story is moments, right? So there is a park in the center of the oval of Pondi, these boulevards I'm describing. It's called Bharati Park. It's a beautiful park. Given that Pondi isn't very large, this is one of these lovely green spaces, and because it's in the center of the city, or rather I should say the center of the oval, it can get quite populated the way that the beach will do in the evenings. This is also great for walks and little kids and older people and the tourists and so on. And in the middle of the park is this monument, and it's called the Ai Mandapam. And Mandapam in Tamil, so that's a Tamil word. It means stage or a hall even. And then Ai I mean, one may not know what that word means, and it turns out it's the name of someone. And you go and look at this monument, and there's a plaque describing this monument, which is in Latin, which is like, what on earth? And the architecture of this monument has these French iconic symbols on the top, what they call the fleur de lis, these sort of flower, petal arrangements on the top. It's all built in stone. And so you're like, what on earth is happening? And it turns out that, Napoleon commissioned this structure to be built to celebrate the memory of a Devadasi who is or was in Tamil culture a dancer. We're talking now a couple centuries old sort of cultural references. And she would be someone who was raised in the performing arts and would be kind of patronized by the court. And so she had no income of her own, but, the court would sort of take care of her and give her money and food and so on, give her a place to stay. And when I say the court, I mean the king and ministers and the people in power. And she was their entertainment. She was someone they could look to for, you could say, the refined arts, but certainly also what all happens after refined arts and food and drink has been consumed, and it's time to go to bed. Sure. So you had this whole mix of this, sort of imagery. And the story goes that Ai was a very successful Devadasi dancer, and she lived in this palatial home. And Krishnadeva, so we're talking enough time ago that we're talking Vijayanagar Empire, and this king is traveling through his lands to basically inspect various things. And actually, he was on his way to go meet someone. So the story goes, he encounters the home of this woman, and he is just so taken by how large it is that he's convinced that this is some great temple or some great shrine, and he must pay obeisances. And I can give you more of the story, or I can read a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll just read like a page, and then I'll quickly summarize the rest. So Krishnadeva stumbled upon an even more wondrous sight than the thing he was off to go. He was actually traveling for originally, because travelers, as we know, they like to get distracted. So he stumbled upon an even more wondrous sight. Somewhere near his destination stood a building so ornate and luminescent that he knew, as only a king could, that it was a sacred temple. All kings are knelt before, but great ones can kneel as well when the occasion demands it. And Krishnadeva fell to his knees before the massive structure and meditated, his entourage following suit. The king could feel a divine silence pressing on his head as he bowed down, as if acknowledging his prayers. But the pressure grew palpable, more a strain than a blessing. The king opened his eyes to see villagers gathered around him, wearing flustered expressions on their faces. He stood up and glared back until one daring villager stepped forward and asked why His Majesty was bent over before this place of all places. Well, because it reminds me of the humility of man in the face of spiritual supremacy, the king said. The villager hesitated. The king demanded an explanation. The villager looked up at the mansion, then back at the king. Did His Majesty know what lay within its walls? The king turned to his advisor, whose gestures were unreadable. He turned back to the man. Wasn't there a deity inside the sanctum? He tried. Something beautiful, unattainable, irresistible, ever benevolent? The villager's face turned red. Yes, there was someone inside. Yes, she was beautiful and unattainable, but not by divine grace. No, she was a temple dancer, regularly patronized by the wealthy men of the village, a Devadasi whose livelihood came from charm and beauty, a woman who was craved by every man in His Majesty's empire. The king could not believe what he was hearing. He demanded that the whore be called outside and made to answer for her grotesque behavior. To think he had almost considered replicating the property's proportions as an addition to his own palace. So he's furious, he's embarrassed, and he basically insults this woman in front of everyone and says, how dare you do what you do? How dare you live in a home like this? How dare you seduce those of us who come by unknowingly? And, who are you? What is your name? And she says, my name is Ai. And the king is, the way I tell the story anyway, he's immediately madly in love with her, but he's madly furious and, like I say, humiliated. So he says, you know what? We have to demolish your home, tear it to the ground, and, you have to change who you are and change your life's purpose. You can't be this kind of woman with these horrible life choices. Do something benevolent for the people. And what she does is so again, the story goes, her house is demolished, and in its place she builds a tank of water, like a reservoir. Mm-hmm. And that mandapam, that tank ends up 200 years later, being the only source of drinking potable water that the French are able to access when they are living and based in Pondi. Mm-hmm. The seawater is too salty, and the waterways and the canals they're not working for whatever reason. So this engineer shows up from Paris, Le Marais, and he goes hunting around and finds this reservoir, and builds a whole canal between that and the center of the city at that time, which is this monument, or around that monument area. And the population then has water to drink, and they're all very grateful. And La Marais writes this story back to Napoleon in France at the time, saying, this was a story I heard about how this woman basically left this water body in her name. And Napoleon says, oh my goodness, we must build something. He writes back. He says, be grateful to Ai. She deserves a monument. Mm-hmm. And so in 1854, this monument is built. It's still there. Mm-hmm. And Ai apparently has three other sisters, Usi, Bangari, and there's one more. And they are all affiliated with different bodies of water. So there is the Usi River, or rather lake, not far away. Usi, also known as Usteri Lake, and then Bangari, someone else. But yeah, there were these Devdasi siblings who, their Midas touch was whatever they touched turned to water, not gold. And they are all kind of embedded into the history of the city. You've got this monument, and you ask anyone in Pondi, what is this thing? Then they will all tell you, it's the Ayu Mandapam, and they'll likely be answering you in Tamil. And you ask them why, and they won't know. And if you tell them, Napoleon built this? They'd be like, who's Napoleon? Or they think I was talking about some South Indian politician or something, totally different reference point. And, pretty amazing.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what
and very well
was
put.
so interesting. All of these stories and backstories, right? More than anything, getting a kind of feel of those, and it's not all. It's not made up, right? All of this is it is there. It's just not known, and a lot of times not even known to locals.
So Aditi, thank you so much. It was wonderful, and I have to say it was mind-blowing, like the way that you've put your book, where it pulls parts of history and then it intervenes with what's happening in the present and talks about the present architecture and the old things, the new things. So it's perfect book. So I'm really glad that you came on Musafir Stories as well and gave us an insight on your work. So thank you so much.
Exactly. And it's also like Faiza mentioned, right? It is beyond for a tourist or for an outsider who goes there for a little bit of a fraud, if I may call. It's mostly about the beach, about the pretty looking buildings, about the cafes and all of that. But what this book truly is, it's really beyond the things that just meet the eye, right? It's definitely beyond that, and it's definitely beyond the boulevards, like you said at the beginning. So thank you so much, Aditi. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Aditi.
This is the teacher moment when the bell is rung and I'm like, no, don't move, kids. I'm not done with my lecture. But you actually bring up a really, really great point, and I wish I'd come to it sooner in the podcast. But this idea of the boulevards, and a lot of the stories I've just told you are all happening within this oval, within these quarters. And I've titled the book Beyond the Boulevards, and people would say, but why? And it turns out that a lot this monument in Bharati Park is to a tank that's far outside the city boundaries as we're describing it. The ashram itself was influenced or was begun by a man from Bengal and a woman from France who came from far, far away and, kind of set this up. You've got these French connections that, of course, go far beyond the geographical boulevards. You've got a thriving Tamil world that all live far outside the boulevards. Pondicherry's, the state, or rather the UT University, is an 800-acre ground that attracts amazing talent and students and has amazing resources and archives and so on. And it is far outside the boulevards. So a lot of Pondi, and where my father grew up, was a little bit outside the boulevards. So, of course, the touristy stuff is within. Some of the sources of this touristy stuff, Adikameda, that archaeological site, is outside the boulevards. Is all kind of from outside and is scattered within some of these boulevards, but then, their stories permeate other parts of the state, other parts of the country, other parts of history and geography. And so I just hope that by the end of the book, the reader sees that, Pondicherry is special because of what they knew already coming in, and then what they've discovered, hopefully, by the end of the book.
Yes.
Absolutely. I definitely, while reading the book, had that feeling of kind of discovering a whole new Pondicherry, right? So I'm sure the listeners and the readers will do that too. But again, thank you so much. Enjoyed every bit of this conversation, and look forward to perhaps another short biography of a new place with a new connection, I hope.
We'll see if the publishers buy my lies the second time around.
But yeah, thank you so much, Aditi.
Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you guys so much.
That was yet another great episode of the Musafir Stories. If you guys like the show, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Audioboom, Savan, Pocket Casts, Castbox, Stitcher, or any other podcasting app available on iOS or Android. Please do leave us a review on iTunes. It goes a long way in the show's discoverability. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. We go by the handle The Musafir Stories. Or, if it suits you, you could email us at themusafirstories@gmail.com or visit our website at www.themusafirstories.com for more information. All of these links will be made available in the show notes section of each episode. So here's to more traveling, sharing, and inspiring. Stay tuned for our next episode. Until then, happy travels and goodbye.